After listening to the Teaching Hard History podcast with guest speaker Dr. Paul Finkelman, I gained a lot more insight on the issue of slavery that has resided in America long in history. One of the first major topics he discusses is the Three-Fifths Compromise, and basically what this was it counted African Americans as 3/5 of a person when it comes to political representation. So not necessarily 3/5 of a person, but rather for counting in terms of like political power, if you will. So the Three-Fifths Compromise really benefited the southern states more than the northern states, obviously because southern states held lots of slaves. So this means that the southern states had larger populations, and since they were counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, it gave them the numbers advantage, which led to, like I said, more political power. Finkelman even quoted, "It simply gave the slave owners more power. It didn't give the slaves any power." And this is true because the slaves weren't being benefited from this. It wasn't giving them more rights or more equality. It was simply giving the slave masters all the power, and they can control the political decisions that happen. So it wasn't addressing slavery, like I mentioned, and this kind of leads into why James Madison opposed of the direct election of a president. So the direct election of a president would mean that it would impose two issues that Madison brought up. One was that each state had different voting rights. They weren't all uniform. They all had like intervening processes for voting. So the solution he thought of the solution that Finkelman stated was that you just create a uniform method so that all votes are counted the same. So an example is all white adult males would have voting rights. But Madison noticed that this would cause another issue. So if you do this method that he was talking about, slaves would not be represented in the voting process, which gives the North more power than the South, because if you're looking solely at population of free adult white males, then the North would have the numbers advantage. The South consisted majority of slave population, which gives the North the political power. Because of these issues, the Electoral College was created, but the Three-Fifths Clause actually impacted its potential. So the Electoral College was a system that attempted to give each state a certain number of electoral votes based on the number of Houses of Representatives it had. And of course, the number of representatives was based on the Three-Fifths Clause. So since the South would have more House of Representatives, they would always have more influence on the presidential election. So this system was flawed from the start because, like I said, more political power and would be towards the South. And it really showed because historically, all the presidents since the Electoral College was founded were either from the South or slave owners, or even the few northern candidates that won had a history of slave ownership. So the correlation is there. Later on, the Migration and Importation Clause was added into the Constitution of Article 1, Section 9. This basically stated that slave trade could not be ended until at least 1808. So it didn't guarantee that by 1808 all slave trade would be abolished. This is a huge misinterpretation of the clause, but obviously, like textbooks, Finkelman actually talked about it, but textbooks would say that in 1808 slave trade ended, but this is actually incorrect. The Fugitive Slave Clause was inserted into the Constitution soon after, mainly because Southern slave owners wanted to have some authority to recapture slaves, because a lot of them would escape and run away to like northern states, and the Northerners were simply exhausted from just constant debate over slavery and legislation, things like that. So they let the North win on this one, but they would not always cooperate with the South for finding their runaway slaves. Overall, from this podcast, I was actually refreshed by all the information given. I did actually enjoy the harsh truths that were laid out to me, hence the name Hard History in the podcast. But like I said, I enjoyed that because a lot of the textbooks, like they were mentioning, don't always tell the exact truth. They kind of simplify it or make it readable for all ages and groups. But I like the truths a lot. So some of them were harsh and they were disturbing, I have to admit. Um, but I mean, it's the truth. It's our history. We have to live with it and learn from it. So some examples I could think of were when they were talking about the one of the first presidential elections with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, when they stated that Thomas Jefferson owned about 200 slaves during this presidential campaign, and even some of them were his children that he bared with one of his other slaves. I believe her name was Sally Hemings. That shocked me. I was just in awe that I didn't realize that someone like Thomas Jefferson, that we kind of highly regard to in history, had this underlined. Another one that shocked me was how the fugitive slave clause worked, in terms of how Southerners can just go up north, find any slave, and essentially state that that was theirs, and with no jurisdiction, take them back to their home. So I feel like there should have been at least some jurisdiction there, because with no evidence or proof, you can essentially grab anyone and just profile them because they're African American. And then lastly, the fact that U.S. military would intervene into rebellions and things like that. I believe the Nat Turner Rebellion was one of them, where the U.S. I believe it was the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy had to eventually put it down, and then same with John Brown when his raid in Virginia he led. It was also suppressed by the U.S. military. I believe it was the Army, but either way, it just seems very extreme that the U.S. military had to intervene in these domestic issues. It makes it seem like the slaves and this whole issue was a major threat to the country. Because when I think of the U.S. military getting involved, I think of more diplomatic relations and foreign issues with other countries. Overall, though, I do not support the Electoral College. I believe it's a flawed system. Many people acknowledge this. To a certain extent, it resolved the issue it was attempting to fix, which was the fact that we needed a uniform way of voting for all the states. But, I mean, like we've mentioned, and I've mentioned, there's no equal representation whatsoever. The South had all the political power leading up to the Civil War, so that means about roughly 70 years since it was created, during the Constitutional Convention, which is about 17 presidential elections where the white Southern candidates had all the power. So I mean, that's such a flawed system, and going on that long is just it's too long to be flawed like that. So they didn't anticipate the effect the Three-Fifths Clause would have on it. Therefore, I don't believe the Electoral College was a great system. Today, I think it's a little bit better with the abolition of slavery, of course, voting rights for African Americans, and women's suffrage. But at the time, it was not a system that I would vote for.